Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a somewhat exciting study about something that happened to planet Earth approximately 445 million years ago. Something that resulted in a kind of a turning point for the entire planet, and the event that resulted in the evolution of one of the most complex types of life on the planet, the vertebrate life. Or to be more exact, our ancient ancestors. All of the complex life that contains a vertebra was surprisingly a result of this one very specific event that also caused one of the biggest extinction events in history. And so in this video, we're going to talk about what's known as LOME, or Late Ordovician Mass Extinction Event, and the creation of life as we know it. With all of this based on this recent study you can find in a description that discusses this mass extinction and the sudden explosion of certain types of life that became extremely common afterwards. But first, let's actually cover the basics, because this particular extinction event was absolutely enormous, and actually much bigger than the one that killed the dinosaurs. This much earlier catastrophe was the first of these so-called Big Five extinctions, and remains the second largest ever in terms of percentage of life lost. Here's roughly how it compares to other extinction events, including the one that killed the dinosaurs. But to understand why this happened and what happened, we basically have to look at what Earth looked like approximately 450 million years ago. And well, this is the so-called Ordovician period. During this time, the planet was a greenhouse. And at that time, almost all of the life lived in the oceans, which is of course where most of the extinction happened when it happened. But a lot of recent studies discovered that this was not just some kind of a major wipeout, this was actually a kind of an ecological reset. A reset that allowed our ancestors, the jawed vertebrates, to finally step out of the shadows and become a predominant species. But Earth back then also looked very different. Here it was mostly dominated by supercontinents, and the most famous one was Gondwana. It was located in the southern hemisphere and resembled something like this. But it was also surrounded by an enormous ocean. But unlike today, this ocean was not dominated by fish, and instead by creatures referred to as conodonts, primitive eel-like animals with very complex teeth that resemble something like this. But there were also a lot of giant shelled animals, such as nautiloids, that in some cases could grow up to about 5 meters long. One of the more famous ones is this one known as Phanerozoic-scope. And so as you can imagine, back then the oceans were extremely different. Naturally, the oceans contain a lot of other animals, including trilobites and sea scorpions, and a lot of other alien-looking species. But what about fish? Well, we know that fish that had jaws already existed. But unlike today, they were basically underdogs. They were extremely small in numbers and were mostly on the bottom of the food chain. But that's until this event 445 million years ago. Because here the environment suddenly started to shift. And it seems to have happened in two deadly pulses. The first one was triggered by a sudden glaciation, and to be more exact, a global ice age. And so here as glaciers spread across Gondwana, they locked away so much water that the sea levels dropped significantly. And this ended up draining a lot of shallow coastal seas where most of the initial life flourished. And this already gave a lot of jawed fish just a little bit of an advantage, mostly because they preferred deep oceans. But then, several million years later, the second pulse hit as well. The climate shifted back to a warm state and the glaciers suddenly melted. And while you may think this is a good thing, it was not a good thing for a lot of sea life. And that's because all of these oceans became flooded with water that was low in oxygen and very high in toxic sulfur, essentially creating conditions inside the water that were extremely inhospitable to most of that ancient life. And so this double event of freezing then suffocating was just a little bit too much for the dominant species of the time, with approximately 85% of all of them eventually becoming extinct. Which brings us to this recent study from 2026, because here they discovered something else very important. And that's because for a very long time paleontologists were a little bit confused by this very bizarre gap. There was actually approximately 50 to 100 million year gap in the fossil record. Now we knew that jawed vertebrates existed, but they didn't seem to become diverse or dominant until much later, specifically in the Devonian period, or the so-called Age of Fishes. And it wasn't actually clear what was happening during these 50 million years and why exactly it took so long. Which is where this team, led by Professor Lawrence Elling and Wahei Hagiwara, compiled a massive database of approximately 2,500 species in order to see how vertebrates reacted to this particular extinction. and what they discovered was fascinating. Now, before the extinction, the oceans were generally saturated with a lot of these jawless conodonts and quite a few large invertebrates. And so there was basically no room for a lot of these jawed fish to move in. But once these extinction pulses began, they slowly started to remove these dominant species, with the survivors being pushed into isolated regions of biodiversity in very specific niches where they could still thrive. And one of the most important such regions turned out to be in South China. And so here in these very isolated pockets, jawed fish did not have to compete with giants anymore, and they managed to find individual niches and even empty niches that were left behind by previously extinct animals. But because they were trapped in these very small geographical areas for millions of years, it was here that they started to diversify and specialize. Here it's even compared to the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos. And so this study discovers that during this extinction event, it was literally a kind of an ecological reset. And so even though vertebrates without a jaw, or jawless vertebrates, still dominated the oceans for at least 40 more million years, the jawed vertebrates, or basically fish, started to already diversify and become better and better in very specific locations where they became dominant. And it was here that they very likely developed the ability to eventually cross oceans. And so following millions of years of isolation, they were eventually able to enter other oceans and then spread like wildfire. And this period of low biodiversity is sometimes referred to as Telima's Gap. It was essentially this period of approximately 3 to 10 million years, during which time there was not a lot of species on the planet. But that's because apparently they were all hiding in extremely specific niches. And once they learned how to cross these niches, the true recovery finally began. Our ancient ancestors, the jawed fish, and so yeah, this right here is probably your grandma or something, finally started to take over the oceans and then eventually evolve into other things as well. And so the reason this particular study is kind of important is because it finally explains what seems to have happened on the planet and how it suddenly led to this transition 450 million years ago. In other words, it explains why in our history the jawed vertebrates appeared so suddenly and why they ultimately prevailed. And the answer in this case seems to be twofold. First, that ice age that emptied the oceans, and then the melting that introduced a lot of toxic stuff that basically killed a lot of their competition. And so if it wasn't for these two events, the oceans would still be ruled by a lot of unusual giant nautiloids and a lot of eel-like conodonts. But more importantly, this research also confirms something really important about evolution. It essentially suggests that evolution follows a kind of a diversity reset cycle, with mass extinctions being extremely important for the constant evolution of complex life. And that's because extinctions do not actually erase life, they just kind of restructure it. They make animals that were probably hiding somewhere become dominant by giving them a new chance. And that's exactly what happened to mammals right after the age of dinosaurs. So basically during the age of T-Rex, mammals were extremely small and very insignificant and were mostly hiding in various niches. But once dinosaurs disappeared, mammalian life took over and became widespread everywhere. And so here every single extinction event removed the weaker dominant species and gave a chance to a smaller, more innovative group that eventually takes over. But in the end, all of us, including you and me, were basically the descendants of those few survivors from those ancient oceans. The survivors that were thriving in the coastal areas of South China Sea, waiting for their chance to rebuild the world's ecosystems. And that's a very important reminder that even some of the most catastrophic events on the planet end up setting stage for completely new paths for different types of life. And so basically it's not always doom and gloom. But when it comes to these massive extinction events, we've actually discussed some other surprising discoveries in the last few months, and you can find those videos in the description. But anyway, on that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.